The second half of our chapter focuses on desert environments. But in order to save some time, I'm not going to cover the second half of the chapter. I'm really just going to introduce a desert and talk about the role of water in deserts. You will not be responsible for learning the rest of the material in this chapter. Just know what a desert is and why water is so important in a desert. When we look at where deserts are on our planet, we'll notice that they make up a very specific area. And this is due to the fact that they're influenced by a lot of different geological processes. Things like mountain building, having streams flowing, wind blowing, gravity pulling, etc. But overall, we see that about 30% of the land on Earth's surface is covered in these arid environments. And an arid environment just means that it's a really dry climate. It doesn't get a whole lot of precipitation. And that precipitation could be in the form of liquid rain, or it could be solid precipitation like snow or hail. But one of the defining things about a dry climate is the amount of precipitation versus the amount of evaporation that happens. In these dry climates, we see that we have more evaporation than precipitation. One of my favorite deserts on the planet, initially you wouldn't think of a desert, but it's Antarctica. It's cold, so it's not a hot desert, but it gets very little precipitation throughout the year, so it's a dry climate. But we can divide our dry climate into those truly arid deserts and what's called a steppe, which is just partially or semi-arid. And we're going to find a lot of these steppes along the edges, where the transition zones of our desert, where the center actual desert is very, very dry, but the outermost edges have a little bit more moisture in them. So we usually see that these are really kind of marginal. They're on the very edges of our deserts, but they have more water. They have higher humidity. But if we look at the pattern of where deserts are on our planet, we'll find that they're in the subtropics, just a little bit north and south of our equator, and in our middle latitudes. When looking at this pattern, we can figure out that we have deserts because of two main reasons. One is wind patterns and wind directions, which we call our prevailing winds, as well as whether they're located on the edges or in the middle or the interior of a continent. If we look at our subtropical areas, the areas that are about 30 degrees north and south of the equator, like Africa, the deserts in Australia, as well as the Middle East, most of these form in subtropical highs. We'll get into this later on with our atmospheric chapters, but here we have subsiding air. We have air that's sinking from high elevations in our atmosphere down to the surface where we live. And as this air sinks or subsides, it's being compressed, and it's warming up as it sinks closer to the surface. Because this air is sinking, it's going to be dry, and it's going to create clear skies. You won't have any clouds, and therefore you're going to have no precipitation. So we see that these deserts that form 30 degrees north and south of the equator form due to the way that our winds are moving. If we have air sinking through our atmosphere, it's going to lead to dry air, and it's going to lead to desert environments. But the other type of desert is going to be found in the middle of a continent, like we see here in Russia. So these mid-latitude deserts and the steppes around their edges are all due to the fact that in the middle of a continent, it's just really far away from an ocean. So we're not going to have all of that evaporated ocean water making its way across this entire continent to the middle before those clouds condense and precipitation occurs. And these are really good examples of how mountain building can affect our climate. If we have mountains that separate these desert areas from the oceans even more, it's going to be even drier. So while deserts don't have a lot of precipitation, when they do, it can be deadly. once we actually have some form of precipitation, we're going to have an ephemeral stream develop. And the word ephemeral just means that it's temporary. These are streams that are only going to be there right after we have some form of rainfall or precipitation. In these desert regions, it's so dry that we have very little vegetation. So we don't have a lot of plants to be able to soak up that rainfall. So instead, we're going to have a lot of runoff and very little infiltration of water into the ground. And this is going to lead to flash floods. And a flash flood is a flood that can be really deadly, and it happens in a flash. Within minutes of a rainstorm beginning, we can have a flash flood occurring. So we see that these ephemeral streams, that are ones that only pop up right after a rainstorm, cause most of the erosion that we see in our deserts. We might think it's wind causing the erosion or breaking down the rocks and the sediment, but the wind is really good at transporting. It's going to be blowing it and moving it around. It's going to be the short, quick rainfalls that do most of the damage when it comes to weathering and eroding the rocks, though.